The Gainesville Ripper's final body count is 5 students.
He loved to kill. He absolutely relished in it. It was the high point of his life.
4 years later, the victims' families finally confront Danny Rolling, their children's alleged killer.
I felt the evil that was in this person.
But is Danny Rolling himself a victim?
He has a very serious illness.
In 1990, Gainesville, Florida is ranked as one of the most desirable places to live in America. And it's home to the 6th largest university campus in the United States. In August, the fall semester is about to begin, and the town is bustling with students. One of them is 18-year-old Sonia Larson.
I mean, this was like her first home away from home and college. And so, yeah, it was an exciting time for her. It's going to be an exciting time for any freshman coming into Gainesville and starting your life.
Nothing could prepare Sonia's family for what happens next. On Sunday, August 26th, Sonia and her roommate, 17-year-old Christina Powell, are found murdered. Both girls had been stabbed repeatedly with a combat knife.
So when the phone call came later about the tragedy, I just screamed. I just screamed and screamed and screamed.
Gainesville is stunned when 9 hours later, a third victim is discovered. 18-year-old sophomore, Krista Hoyt. She had also been viciously stabbed with the same kind of weapon.
Krista was a person that loved life. She was the type of person that was very caring.
Krista's family is still struggling to come to terms with her death when they're hit with another shock. The local press reveals the gruesome details of their daughter's murder.
We only knew that she had been stabbed. We did not know that she had her breast cut off, or that she had been gutted, or that she had been beheaded, and that their head had been moved to a different section in the apartment. We didn't know any of that, so this is total shock to us.
All 3 of the victims were sexually assaulted and grotesquely mutilated. But the body count continues to rise. 2 days later, Manuel Taboada and his roommate, Tracy Pauls, both 23, are found butchered in their apartment. A media frenzy descends on the town, which is now dubbed Grizzly Gainesville. The once peaceful community is gripped by terror. With no one knowing when or where the killer will strike next, students leave the town in droves.
I'm scared to death. I called my mom and she was crying. She said, just come home. I'm just really scared. This whole thing is just hitting so close to home.
It was amazing that for several weeks it was unlike any panic you would see in a small town.
Within days of the murders, Florida launches one of the most expensive manhunts in its history to track down the Gainesville Ripper. The police assemble a task force of over 150 agents who pursue thousands of leads. But what investigators don't realize is how close they have already come to catching the killer. The same day the bodies of Manuel Taboada and Tracy Pauls were discovered, Gainesville police officers had pursued a man they suspected of bank robbery. Although he manages to evade capture, the police stumble across his campsite. It's close to where Krista Hoyt had been murdered. In his tent, they had found stolen cash from a local bank. With the robber still at large, they seized his belongings and stored them as evidence. Then, on September 7th, just over a week after the Gainesville murders, police in nearby Ocala County, Florida, arrest 36-year-old drifter Danny Harold Rolling. He is charged with the attempted armed robbery of a local supermarket. 4 days later, a judge finds Danny Rolling guilty and sentences him to jail. Meanwhile, in Gainesville, the killing spree ends as abruptly as it started.
And people kept wondering, why did it stop? We now know that's because of the bank robberies, but we didn't know that at the time, and so people lived in just tremendous fear.
Finally, in January 1991, 5 months after the murders, the task force gets a break. A tip-off from police in Shreveport, Louisiana Danny Rolling's hometown.
A similar type murder had taken place where he had staged the victims.
Police in Gainesville have learned that a local robber, Danny Rolling, is the chief suspect in a gruesome triple murder in Shreveport, Louisiana. The crime bears striking similarities to the recent murders in Gainesville. The victims had been stabbed to death and their bodies posed grotesquely.
A similar type murder had taken place where he had staged the victims. And they had him as a suspect.
The Gainesville police now revisit all the crimes committed in the town at the time of the murders. They examine the items found in the bank robber's campsite in the woods. The evidence includes a screwdriver, a ski mask, and a cassette tape deck. Only now do they play a cassette found in the player, apparently recorded on the night of the first murder. It begins.
Danny Harold Rolling.
That puts Danny Rolling in Gainesville when the murders took place. On the tape, he describes how to butcher a deer.
Aim for the lungs, straight through the rib cage. Either there or the heart, but he'll stay right there until he bleeds to death.
And that's exactly the method he used on some victims.
The tape ends with an ominous suggestion.
Well, I'm going to sign off for a little bit. That's something I got to do.
The task force is overjoyed when DNA tests come back, linking 3 of the murders to Rolling's campsite. Rolling claims he is innocent. So over the next 3 years, the task force gathers a wealth of evidence against him. Finally, on February 15th, 1994, 4 years after the Gainesville murders, Danny Rolling enters an Alachua County courthouse. It is the first time the victims' families come face to face with their loved one's alleged killer.
I felt the evil that was in this person that had committed these crimes. I could just think that this was the last person that had looked in Krista's eyes.
Chief Prosecutor Rod Smith, a native of Gainesville, has spent months preparing his case.
Rolling was so much pressure, and I felt like if I did something wrong, I will have let down people who've known me since before I was a lawyer.
But as the court moves to select the jury, Rolling makes a shocking announcement.
There are some things that you just can't run from, and this being one of those.
Rolling changes his plea to guilty to all 5 counts of murder.
He was trying to manipulate his sentence. He did not want to get the death penalty.
But I really didn't feel like he had any remorse. I really felt more like that he was proud of what he had done.
Rod Smith has no intention of allowing this vicious killer to manipulate his sentence.
What I wanted to make sure is I wasn't going to allow that to plea to be the method by which suddenly the jury didn't get to really find out how bad he was.
He is determined to get the death penalty. But first, he must convince the jury. February 1994. Prosecutor Rod Smith sets out to prove that Danny Rolling committed premeditated, cold-blooded murder 5 times.
We really had to go back and paint Danny for what he was, which was a sexual aberrant, a mean and vicious person.
He describes how Rolling had assembled a murder kit, which included a screwdriver, duct tape, a ski mask, and a combat knife.
The detail by which we were able to go back and find how he had bought the knife. He made a purchase. He paid about $34 plus tax. He bought an item in the Army-Navy store through the use of the barcode. The item he purchased was a Marine Corps AR knife. The depth of his planning for this event gave the juror the idea that this was something he came here to do, nothing but to do this. He was going to visit this misery on a college town.
Next, Smith produces one of his key exhibits, the photographs of the crime scenes.
They certainly were something that they got your attention unlike anything you would imagine.
The images show how Rolling mutilated and posed his victims' body parts to provoke and shock those who found them.
Jurors were so taken aback that some asked not to proceed that day.
Smith notices that the crime scene photographs even seem to affect the normally impassive Rolling.
Every time a photograph of what he had done was there, Rolling would almost avert his eyes and even physically act like he was getting ill. Well, of course, I continued to make sure every time I got a chance at that point in time, I'd put it in front of him.
Finally, Smith produces his most damning piece of evidence, Rolling himself.
Probably the breakthrough in the case, which we then kind of recreated for the jury, to me, was how we came to finally get Danny to talk.
While in prison awaiting trial, Rolling told investigators he wanted to confess to his crimes through fellow inmate Bobby Lewis. During a 3-hour confession, Rolling admitted to all 5 murders.
I'm now willing to make a statement and answer any questions concerning the Gainesville student murder case and/or any other crime which I have participated in.
Smith also reveals that Rolling boasted to his fellow inmates about the chilling details of his victims' last hours.
3 of the victims he literally tortured for sexually and otherwise for hours. He talked to them, he told them what he was going to do to them, and he told them how it was going to be. It's unimaginable, the horror.
But perhaps the prosecution's most important testimony is that which reveals the killer's real motive for the murders. Their witness is hardened criminal and Rolling's confessor, Bobby Lewis.
He was trying to terrorize the city of Gainesville. He was trying to make himself infamous or famous, to be a superstar amongst criminals.
Now it's Rolling's defense team's turn to try and convince the jury that their client is not accountable for his crimes. If they succeed, they could save Rolling from the death penalty. Their evidence excusing Rolling for his actions comes from the same police interview in which he confessed to his crimes. In it, he identified an alter ego he called Gemini.
The person that I really have struggled against to prevent becoming, to prevent really my thoughts and stuff is a person called Gemini, who is evil.
In the trial of the Gainesville Ripper, Danny Rolling, the defense presents several witnesses to back up their claim of mental illness. From expert psychiatrists.
He has a very serious illness.
To Rolling's own family.
Danny would talk about visions of demons, people in his dreams beating him, torturing him.
But in cross-examination, the prosecution dismisses Rolling's Gemini explanation as a deliberate ploy to bolster his insanity claim.
He had watched this movie, The Exorcist Part 3 or Part 4. He told these scenes that were right out of a movie that he had just watched over at the theater in Gainesville. I think jurors then found all of that to be laughable.
The greatest threat to the prosecution lies in the defense's evidence of Rolling's violent upbringing.
They were going to try to show that Danny had had this abused childhood and that he was really just the victim of a set of circumstances in his life and that they ought to spare his life.
The defense claims that from an early age, Rolling was repeatedly bullied, beaten, and humiliated by his father. A key witness for the defense is Rolling's terminally ill mother, Claudia, who testifies by video link.
Did there come a time when you think the way your husband was treating Danny was inappropriate?
I always felt it was.
She describes in detail the violent relationship between Rolling and his father.
He had a way of, he'd make a fist, and in the top of their head, he'd do this real hard.
Still, the victims' families feel no sympathy.
I believe that there are many people that grow up in adverse conditions, but children don't always grow up to be serial killers.
On March 22, 1994, Rod Smith makes his closing argument. Despite Rolling's confession and a wealth of damning evidence, Smith's hopes for the death sentence hangs in the balance. The jury must now decide the fate of Danny Rolling. It takes 2 days of deliberation for them to reach their decision.
But it was a nail-biter because you just didn't know what was going to come out.
I was not at all calm and collected. I was a nervous wreck.
When the jury went out at the end of the trial, I felt like they should come back right away with the verdict and that it would be the death penalty. But they didn't come back right away. And we had to wait overnight. I just prayed constantly.
Finally, on March 24th, 1994, the jury returns.
So, Mr. Clerk, if you would publish the verdict of the jury, please.
The first-degree murder.
One by one, they announce their unanimous decision. Danny Rolling is guilty of first-degree murder on all 5 counts.
That it imposed the death penalty upon Danny Harold.
Judge Stanley Morris then delivers his judgment.
It is ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Danny Harold Rolling, is hereby sentenced to death for the victim.
For the families, it's the culmination of 4 years of unbelievable grief.
Those families had spent every single day from the day they received the first phone call living over this.
When I got through with that trial, I was in shock. I was in total shock from all the anxiety and sadness that I had in me.
Even with Rolling's conviction and sentence, it will never replace the lives he destroyed.
It will never be over for us. Mom said that until she's 6 feet under, that's when it'll be over for her.
And the families know that justice could still be a long time coming.
But I also knew that here in the state of Florida, things can go on for 10, 15, 20 years before that happens.
Not until 16 years later, on October 25th, 2006, does Rolling's execution finally take place. The victims' families come together once more to witness the final moments of their loved one's murderer. Rolling is administered a lethal injection and draws his last breath at approximately 6:13 p.m.
He died such an easy death. I mean, it's no pain at all. They give him a painkiller and then they kill him. Danny
Rolling may be gone, but the community he terrorized will never fully recover from his horrific crimes.
Rollings didn't just kill 5 students. He had his toll on everybody from the horrendous acts he did.
Today, on the University of Florida's Gainesville campus, a grove of trees stands as a permanent memorial to ensure that his 5 victims will never be forgotten.
I'll always think of these kids, and I'll always think of that for those families. Never fails. Probably won't till the day I die.